In ancient Rome, food storage was a daily battle against time. No fridges, no freezers, just the sun working overtime to ruin your dinner. If you've ever left a steak on the counter for too long, you get the idea. But Romans weren't about to let their hard-earned meals rot. They mastered food preservation so well that some of their methods still survive today. And at the top of it all was salt. It is Rome's ultimate food insurance. If Romans had a food preservation slogan, it would have been, when in doubt, add salt. Salt was their go-to method for making sure meat didn't turn into a science experiment. They would coat fish, pork, and even vegetables with so much salt, it was basically the ancient equivalent of putting your food in a witness protection program, because nothing was getting to it. And they weren't playing around when it came to salt production. Romans built massive salt farms, and they even had a whole road dedicated to moving salt across the empire. It was called the Via Salari, literally the Salt Road, because when Rome did something, they went big. But preserving food was just the beginning. Romans took salt and turned it into their most prized condiment, garum. Now, if you're imagining some fancy sea salt infused with herbs, stop right there. Garum was made by fermenting fish guts in the sun for months. Yes, months. It smelled about as good as a tuna sandwich left in a hot car for a week. In fact, it was so pungent that even the people making it probably questioned their life choices. And yet, the Romans were obsessed. They put it on everything: bread, meat, vegetables, even fruit. It was the ketchup of ancient Rome, if ketchup smelled like a fish market during a heat wave. And do you know what is the best part? Archaeologists have found 2,000-year-old jars of garum that are still technically edible. That is right, fish sauce old enough to have grandkids. But if you ever want to taste authentic ancient Rome, just imagine fish sauce that is old enough to qualify for Social Security. Now let's talk about meat. You are a Roman with a nice chunk of it, but no fridge, no freezer, just time and a rapidly approaching expiration date. So, what do? You could drown it in salt until it is basically a brick of sodium, but if you actually want it to taste good, you smoke it. Smoking wasn't just cooking, nope. For Romans, it was ancient meal prep at its finest. They would take cuts of pork, lamb, and even fish, hang them over a fire, let the smoke do its thing, and boom, weeks of preserved meat. And this wasn't just some home cooking hack. Imagine dragging yourself through some muddy battlefield covered in armor and pulling out a smoked pig leg from your backpack like it is a protein bar. Smoked meat didn't need fancy storage. No clay jars, no underground cellars, just a smoky, hardened slab of protein chilling on a wooden shelf waiting for the next meal. And the Romans experimented with different woods for flavor, like oak, beech, and even imported fruit woods to give their meats a richer, slightly sweet taste. They added spices, honey, and wine to create meat that wasn't just preserved, it was gourmet. In fact, some of their smoking techniques were so advanced that historians believe they influenced European cured meats like prosciutto and speck. And if that jerky is starting to look questionable, don't worry, Romans had a fix for that too. Pickling. Have you ever found a jar of pickles in your fridge so old it will probably qualify as a science experiment? Yeah, the Romans would have called that perfectly aged. Well, the Romans didn't have fridges, but they figured out pickling way before we did. And instead of vinegar, they mostly used brine, aka salt water so strong even bacteria just gave up trying. And they pickled everything: vegetables, meat, fish. If it could fit in a jar, it was getting dunked. Cabbage, onions, olives, and even exotic fruits were stored in clay pots full of brine, locking in their flavors for months. But this wasn't just some side dish situation. Pickled food was crucial for soldiers, sailors, and even gladiators. Romans swore that eating pickled veggies helped with digestion and endurance, basically the ancient equivalent of Gatorade. In fact, some historians believe the reason Roman soldiers could march for days wasn't just their training, it was their high-sodium, low-chance-of-food poisoning diet. They weren't just tossing cucumbers in a jar and calling it a day. They tested it with herbs, spices, and even honey to elevate the flavor. Wealthy Romans even imported pickled goods from across the empire: Syrian pickled cucumbers, Egyptian preserved lemons, and Iberian olives. And if you think pickled food was just a snack, think again. Romans swore by pickled cabbage as a hangover cure. Yeah, imagine you have had a little too much at a Roman feast, too much wine, too much roasted boar, and instead of aspirin, your friend slides over a bowl of soggy pickled cabbage. No water, no painkillers, just you, your regret, and a mouthful of salty leaves. Did it actually work? No clue. But hey, if you ever need an excuse to avoid a morning after pickle snack, congrats. You now have historical evidence. But pickling wasn't their only trick. Romans also found a way to turn the sun into their fridge. Suppose you got your hands on some fresh figs, a nice cut of meat, maybe some fish. But there is a problem. If you don't eat it fast, it is going to turn into a science experiment. And since the Romans didn't have the luxury of slapping a best before sticker on everything, they had to get creative. That is when they discovered the secret of drying, aka the set it and forget it method of food preservation. The concept was simple. Take the moisture out and bacteria can't throw a party on your food. The Romans would lay out fruits, veggies, and meat under the sun and let that Mediterranean heat do the heavy lifting. But it's not like they just kept the food outside and hoped for the best. They had a strategy. They built drying racks, elevated wooden platforms, and even entire rooms dedicated to dehydrating food. In some cases, they would string up meat like decorations at a medieval holiday market, except instead of looking festive, it just smelled like a butcher shop in July. And if the sun wasn't enough, they used fire. Romans used slow, controlled heat to speed up the process to create something similar to modern-day jerky. And calling this useful is an understatement. It was practically military grade. Dried meat was lightweight, didn't spoil, and Roman soldiers could carry it for weeks without it turning into a biohazard. And this wasn't just their one secret of preserving food, it became one of their major ways to earn money. Dried fish, for example, was a hot commodity. Ports along the Mediterranean were stacked with barrels of dried seafood, traded across the empire like the ancient version of canned tuna. Dried figs? A delicacy. Dried grapes? Congrats. You just invented raisins. And those raisins? They were so valued that Roman politicians used them as bribes. Vote for me, and I will throw in a basket of premium dried fruit. But not everything could be dried. Fresh herbs, vegetables, even fish. Sometimes you wanted to keep food without turning it into a raisin's ugly cousin. That is where oil came in. It was basically ancient Rome's version of a Tupperware container. Romans figured out that if you drown food in enough oil, bacteria can't crash the party. And honestly, the Romans loved olive oil. They bathed in it, they used it as medicine, and they even paid their taxes with it. So naturally, they also shoved their food in it. They would take fresh basil, rosemary, garlic, basically anything they didn't want turning into compost, and dunk it in a clay jar full of olive oil. Not only did this keep it fresh, but it turned the oil into a flavor bomb. And it wasn't just herbs. Cheese, vegetables, even fish ended up submerged in massive clay amphorae, which is just a fancy way of saying ancient Roman storage jar. And these jars were so well sealed that archaeologists have actually found Roman olive oil that is still intact today. Romans also believed certain types of preserved foods could bring good luck. Some high-ranking officials would carry small jars of oil-preserved olives as a kind of ancient good luck charm. Superstitious? Maybe. But hey, if carrying around pickled cucumbers made them feel powerful, who were we to judge? And when food needed more than just luck to stay fresh, Romans went underground. Literally. Beneath the streets of Rome, past the bathhouses and noisy markets, there were underground food storage spaces doing the real work of keeping the empire fed. Without fridges, people had to get smart, so they dug deep. Romans used cool cellars, carved out rock chambers, and stone-lined pits to keep food fresh for months. These spaces took advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. They stayed cool in the summer and just warm enough in the winter to keep things from freezing solid. For the rich, these cellars were top tier. They had ventilation shafts, controlled humidity, and everything was organized like a Roman version of the container store. Grains and dried goods up top, root vegetables buried in the colder sections below. For regular folks, the setup was simpler. Stone-lined pits covered with straw or clay lids did the trick. These were lifesavers in colder regions, where properly stored food meant the difference between making it through winter or seriously regretting your life choices. But this wasn't just about stopping food from going bad. Some things actually got better the longer they sat underground. Wine, for example. Romans aged it in these cool, dark spaces, letting it develop deeper flavors. Cheesemakers did the same. They stored wheels of cheese in cellars so they could mature into expensive delicacies. Funny how today people drop ridiculous amounts of money on aged cheeses, while Romans were just leaving their food in a hole for a few months and calling it gourmet. Some of these Roman cellars still exist. In fact, wine cellars today still use the same principles because if something worked 2,000 years ago, why mess with it? But not everyone wanted their food to be salted, smoked, or dried into something tougher than a gladiator's sandal. Romans had another trick, which they called lard. They figured out that cooked meat could be preserved for months if it was completely submerged in melted fat. It was like an ancient vacuum seal. No oxygen, no bacteria, no spoilage. Once the meat was fully covered in lard and stored in a clay jar, it could last over 6 months without going bad. Over time, the fat infused the meat with extra flavor, making it even more tender. Romans preserved sausages, bacon, and roasted meats this way, layering them with garlic, fennel, and herbs. Soldiers carried jars of lard-sealed meat on long campaigns to make sure they always had a high-protein snack that wouldn't spoil. This wasn't just a Roman thing either. People in Europe used the same method for centuries. In Slovakia, for example, families stored sausages and bacon in lard well into the 20th century. And even today, French chefs still use this technique in duck confit, a dish that is basically meat preserved in its own fat. So when a fancy French restaurant charges you $40 for duck confit, just remember you are basically eating a Roman army ration with better marketing. But if Rome had a true food-preserving superpower, it was fermentation. And it wasn't just about making wine or that same stinking fish sauce Romans loved. It was one of their most powerful methods against food spoilage. It turned decomposable foods into something that could last for months or even years, all without refrigeration. And if you think fermentation was just an accidental discovery, Romans actually had an entire system behind it. Fermentation happens when bacteria or yeast break down sugars into acids or alcohol, creating an environment where bad bacteria can't survive. This meant food lasted longer and even became safer to eat. Grain storage was a huge deal in Rome. Wheat was the foundation of the Roman diet, but without protection, it could spoil fast. Romans figured out that if they let grains ferment slightly before storage, it created a protective layer that kept mold and pests away. This wasn't fully baking or cooking the grains. It was a process similar to how some modern bread starters work. They treated their wheat like people treat sourdough starters today. Vegetables were also preserved through fermentation. Romans stored cabbages, onions, and turnips in brine, salt water strong enough to make bacteria give up. The fermentation process produced lactic acid, which acted like a natural preservative, keeping vegetables crisp and edible for months. And of course, fermented dairy. Milk spoiled fast, but when turned into cheese or yogurt, it lasted for months or even years. Romans stored their cheeses in underground cellars, letting them develop bold, funky flavors, which explains why today the stinkiest cheeses are somehow the most expensive in your favorite restaurant. Fermentation wasn't just a backup plan, it was a scientifically sound, even if they didn't know it at the time, way to store food for the long haul. They also used honey, not just as a sweetener, but as a way to keep food from spoiling. If you have ever wondered what food lasts forever, this is it. honey doesn't go bad, and the Romans took full advantage of that, using it to preserve everything from fruits to meat. Because of its high sugar content and antibacterial properties, nothing nasty can grow in it. Bacteria, mold, spoilage, not happening. That made it perfect for preserving food without refrigeration. The Romans took full advantage of this. They stored fresh fruits like figs and pears in honey, sealing them in clay jars for months. The result came out in the form of a soft, syrupy, naturally candied fruit that somehow tasted even better than when it was fresh. And just like that, Romans turned their fruit into nature's version of gummy candy. But the interesting part was that they also preserved meat in honey. Yep, cooked meats were coated in honey and stored in sealed jars that kept them from spoiling while infusing them with extra flavor. If you have ever had honey-glazed ham, congrats, you are eating a dish that Romans perfected 2,000 years ago. And for Romans, honey was a medicine, skincare product, and even a preserving agent. Technically, you could eat honey older than the Roman Empire and be totally fine. That is some next-level food preservation. The next time you are worried about your food going bad, just remember, the Romans had this figured out 2,000 years ago. While we are out here relying on fridges and expiration dates, the Romans were outsmarting food spoilage with nothing but salt, smoke, oil, and some seriously creative thinking. And considering we still use many of these preservation methods today, makes you wonder if maybe they were onto something. So which of these methods would you actually try today? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and check out our other videos. We have got plenty more crazy history and forgotten tricks coming your way. See you in the next one.